Hello and welcome. My name is Mary Rouse, and I am a volunteer member of the Friends of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Libraries Board. We hope you will be motivated to learn more about the good works of our organization on our website, follow us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Because our time together is so limited, our speaker serves as only one of many examples as to how the Friends support research and scholarship in our libraries. Under my watch as Dean of Students from 1987 to 2000, I had the really good fortune, to supervise and support the growth and development of the UW-Madison McBurney Disability Resource Center. So it is my pleasure to introduce its current director and assistant dean, Mari Magler, who will serve as the discussion partner for our author, Kim Nielsen. I will also introduce her. She conducted her research, thanks in part to modest financial support from the Friends, right here in Madison. Her book, The Life of Anna Ott, Money, Marriage, and Madness, is what brings us together today. She is the current professor and chair of disability studies at the University of Toledo. She is the author of 6 other books besides this one, is founding president of the very important Disability History Association, and has received numerous national and international teaching awards. Please welcome Kim Nielsen and Mari Magler to our virtual stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Kim, for joining this conversation today, and for your contributions in capturing and recording disability history is so important. Just to repeat, I'm Mari Magler, and just to do a really quick visual description of myself, I am a white woman. I have about chin-length brown, mostly silvery hair. I'm wearing a deep pink outfit today with a silver necklace, and I'm seated in my campus office with some art and some overhead filing cabinets behind me. So if we can dive in, Kim, I just want to say and acknowledge that 2020 has been a challenging year for many reasons, right? But certainly how disabled folks are impacted by racial injustices as well as the pandemic is central to the times. So as we dive into the book, the subject of this book, I'd love to hear you talk about why disability history is important and how it influences current events or how we think of current events.
Yeah, Mari, those are great questions. And maybe I'll start with an audio or visual description as well. I am a mid-50s white woman with long hair, dark brown hair. It's longer than it's ever been because I have not had it cut since the pandemic. In a room with white walls, and I'm wearing blue and black. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. And it has been a year, I think, for all of us as individuals and as a society. And it's been a year, I think, in which disability history, the impact of everything that's happened regarding disability history is very up in front and center in everything we talk about. Regarding the pandemic, you know, the US has a long history of eugenic thoughts and actions, eugenic laws, and the early shortages of PPE, the early shortages of medical equipment such as ventilators, and the discussion and the limiting of those for people with disabilities has really scared and impacted people with disabilities and their allies. And we're going to continue to talk about that as we see the reoccurrence of those shortages now and in the months ahead. We see that in Wisconsin, where I am currently in Ohio, elsewhere across the nation. And so, you know, that is reflecting the realities of disability history in the US. And these are realistic concerns. I think also we've been really wrestling as a society with the continuation and the history of racism in the United States. Mm-hmm. We know that ableism and racism have often interwoven throughout US history. You know, Black people are more likely than whites to have chronic health issues, often due to the pollution of neighborhoods in which they often live, where poor income housing is sometimes, are more likely to struggle when accessing mental health access care are more less likely to receive formal diagnoses of disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, one thing that is coming out is that those who experience police violence are both disproportionately African American, but also disproportionately disabled. And so there's so much of disability history and the impact of the last hundreds of years that are very much forefront in the struggles that all of us are having today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to talk about those and recognize those and strategize about how to work together.
Awesome. And it's sometimes hard to find records of, just disability history, which is so your area. So I'm looking forward to kind of picking your brain about that a little bit more. Why don't we talk a little bit about the subject of the book,
Sure.
right? Mrs. Dr. Anna Ott. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write about her, and why you felt her story was important to share?
Yeah, and isn't that term lovely, Mrs. Dr. Anna Ott?
Right.
In the 19th century, folks could not even get themselves to call a female doctor somebody, that they had to put the Mrs. title in front of the Mrs. Dr. Anna Ott. I sort of fell into her story, and I think she's a really great historical figure because she's so ordinary and she's so extraordinary.
Mm.
And I think, tonight I really want to emphasize that I was able to find her, quite literally find her, and then do research on her because of the support provided by the Friends of the Libraries. And that's so important for scholars. But she was a woman who lived and served as a physician in Madison, one of only 2 female physicians in the state from 1856 to 1873. And then she was what was then called an inmate. She was a patient, an inmate, at the Wisconsin State Hospital for the Insane from 1873 to 1893. And she died there, like so many others of her time period. She was also a wealthy woman, and she was made wealthy by very strategic use of divorce in her case, and then very, very wise investment of money into land all across the Midwest, as well as at one point she owned at least one of the blocks around this current state capitol in Madison, and other properties nearby. She was a survivor of 2 tumultuous marriages, one of which was very, very violent. And then, she was institutionalized for 20 years and placed under legal guardianship. So she had no legal rights as an adult, even the limited rights that a white woman would have had at this time. So I think that the legal conditions she experienced that all white women faced at that point in time. And yet she was very extraordinary, for these reasons I've laid out. As I said, she was an accidental discovery of mine. She's somebody who was unknown to history. And I always say that being a historian is like being both a detective and a professional gossip. And, that's what we do. We find little bits and we chase them down and we chase them down and we chase them down. And I found, one small reference to her as one of the adults in Dane County placed under legal guardianship. And she was unique in that she was wealthy and because she'd been a physician. And at that point, that was all I knew about her. And I first intended to write maybe a paragraph about her, and then here I am. It's like a black hole. But I think she's important because, the ways that she can exemplify what we know about women's lives at this point in time, but also about asylums and diagnosis. We know a lot in U.S. history about psych asylums and their leadership, but we know very, very little about the people who were contained within them, often against their will. We can also see in her life the legal vulnerabilities of U.S. women, of the lack of safety options for white women, the lack of legal rights for people determined to be insane and having gotten psych diagnoses, for anyone with a stigmatized diagnosis. I think it's really important to look at her.
And so this was not your original plan. You were originally researching on kind of a broader topic, right?
Yeah, I was, and it's interesting to me because I'm, as I get older, I've written more books, and I've always had a plan to write a specific book, and instead I fell into her completely. I had plans to write a completely different book, but I was so fascinated by her story and by everything I learned, and I don't want to give away the plot, but it eventually grew to involve a bank robbery and all kinds of things that I never anticipated. So it was a task in which the research was great fun for me, and that I also had to work very hard on the research and be creative. But I think she's such an important story because she's fascinating to me, because I wonder how many people like her there were. And I think there were many, many about whom that we simply don't know their lives, and who received stigmatized psych diagnoses, were institutionalized for decades, and lost track of by their families, or are ignored by their families.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to capture those people who are so isolated and disregarded.
I feel like for whatever reason, the idea of agency has been a common theme for me lately. And this was a perfect example of someone kind of losing agency, right?
Yeah, I think both legal agency, personal agency, physical, in terms of she was contained within the asylum and couldn't go places, but who also at the same time worked really hard to try and exercise agency, even while institutionalized. And so I think it's a fine balancing act to both talk about the lack of agency that she had and the agency that she did have, both before and after her years of institutionalization.
Totally. I think we generally, right, understand privilege. And if you understand that if you hold privilege in one area, you may still experience oppression and prejudice in another area. So you and I talked, you mentioned that you had to really juggle privileges of money and class with ableism, institutionalism, and patriarchy and violence even. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think scholars, pop culture, radio shows love to throw around this term intersectionality, both in positive and negative ways. But what I think is one of the richnesses, the difficulties of talking about Anna Ott is that it's not, I can't simply say she lived a privileged life or she lived an oppressed life. That it's not that clear. It's far more complicated, and that she experienced both of them, and often in multiple ways simultaneously, or varying from situation to situation. She was a wealthy white woman, and that gave her great privilege. And she was a physician, and that gave her privilege. At the same time, that also made her odd, if I can simply word, and stand out, and questionable to many people because of patriarchy and sexism. So even those things that privileged her made others very skeptical about her. And I also know she lived in a very violent marriage and had very few recourses. And there's stories we know of her and her daughter being thrown out of the house in the middle of a Wisconsin snowstorm one night, late at night, and knocking at the doors of a neighbor simply because to be taken in. She'd been beaten, thrown out of the house by her husband, George. So she experienced that oppression as well. And it's fascinating to me too, because she also bought land right as Wisconsin became a state, and often land that had been directly stolen from the various tribal nations around them, right? So she's a really complicated figure in exercising both privilege and oppression, and even while she was institutionalized. She lost legal rights, she lost control of her money, and yet she was lucky enough to she had a legal guardian who let her spend some of it as she wanted.
That complexity.
So to learn. Yeah, she had a seamstress come into the insane asylum 3 or 4 times a year to make her new dresses. it's this complicated balance of oppression and privilege.
Definitely, which I think always exists, right?
Yes.
It's not unique to her, but I think we often forget about it. And especially those of us that are doing kind of specific identity work. I'll speak for myself, right? Sometimes I can be really focused on the disabled part of an identity, but there's so much more that's always impacting every individual.
Yeah, and as you said, for everyone, and that it's not entirely predictive.
Right.
We can't say because of XXX identities, this will be your life. And I think Anna Ott shows that it's not predictive, but it is important that we think about all these identities and experiences.
Right. So prior to this book, to your research, it seems that Ott was really unknown to anyone today. In fact, in the book that you say that ableism has really erased her from history. Can you talk a little bit more about why or how that occurs?
Yeah, as far as I can figure out, no one knew about her in today's culture. She had really been erased. And even by the time of her death, after 20 years of institutionalization, even before her death, she was often erased. She had been mentioned in like physicians' newspapers, records, before her institutionalization, but after that, there's an effort, I think, of embarrassment and shame about her psych diagnosis. And she was from those, no longer mentioned in any of those records. But I think that, the biggest thing is that institutionalization often erases people. They lose family contact. They don't enter the legal records much anymore. They're not in, very rarely, I guess, in family letters. They're not in organizational events, the kinds of things that historians often turn to. It erases people and removes them from the public sphere. She got a very stigmatized diagnosis. Psych diagnoses still have very significant stigma. And there's, some evidence that suggests that various folks simply did not want to claim her at all. And we're very happy to forget her and erase her presence because of that stigma of ableism and the psych diagnosis.
And you mentioned not only erasure, but the rewriting in some cases.
Yeah. She and her husband, it's so fascinating to me. For example, she and her husband built a really glorious house in Madison from all the records. It's now, it was on the lake. It doesn't exist anymore. But, it appears that everybody in town knew that she had been beaten by her husband, that she was in the psych asylum. And yet, by the 1930s, the stories were that her husband had built the house with 2 doors in every room so that he could escape from her all the time. And yet, clearly, during her life, everybody knew the violence went a very different direction. So I think, the fact that she spent all those years in the psych asylum enabled people to rewrite that historical record.
Mm-hmm. I was just talking with a student staff here in the McBurney Center just before we started this conversation, and I was saying how this is one of those books that draws you in and gets you all fired up as well. If you can identify with any of the identities, or even if you can't, I mean, I definitely found myself as I was reading it getting, just having lots of emotional reactions to like the things that happen, even though we know that that's kind of time-wise, historically, we know that things like that existed, but still the ways in which she was treated and the decisions that were taken out of her control are just stark, I guess.
Yeah, they are. And I think, for me personally, reading the reams of paper about the physical violence she experienced in her marriage, and then everything that was written about life in psychiatric institutions in the late 19th century is just haunting. And it's so disturbing.
I'm sure.
And it's very scary.
Definitely. So we do have a question from Steve Holtzman, who asks, what sources did you use to discover Mrs. Dr. Ott?
Well, I started with her guardianship file, which is largely financial. And I then, I don't remember the whole progression, but I discovered some newspaper coverage in Madison from the time she moved there in 1856 until 1873. I found a lot of land records of property she purchased, beginning in the early 1850s throughout the entire Midwest. Census records were very important. I also was eventually able to find the divorce records from her first husband in Ohio, very near me in Chillicothe, and then in the State Historical Society in Madison. With each of her husbands, there were at least 3 or 4 divorce attempts by one or the other before the actual divorce took place over decades. So the divorce records are very rich. Once I knew all of that, I could get her medical file from the State Historical Society. Those are protected, but because I was simply looking for one and because it was very old, I was able to get her record. It did make me think, today, I don't know if the rest of you, right? We go to the doc and a 15-minute visit generates about 30 pages of paper.
Right.
Your record was about 9 pages. And so it's a very different kind of file than what you might anticipate today.
I know I was struck by specifically your description of the time she was institutionalized and how few words kind of were used to note not only her treatment, but her behavior. And I also got really interested or fired up about the words that were used to describe. So words linked to or associated with her diagnosis of insanity, also really tied closely to what it meant or what it looked like to be a woman or a proper woman in the time, right? So ladylike was when she was being good, behaving, right? Unwomanly, used to describe behaviors that were not appropriate or more in line with insanity.
Yes. Yeah, the adjectives are really fascinating. As you say, unwomanly was used very frequently to define her in very negative ways or diagnose her in negative ways. Unchanged was actually the most frequent description of her, which I found really unhelpful as a historian. But unchanged was used very, very often to describe her. Argumentative. It's very clear from the medical record that she tried to boss folks around within the asylum.
Yeah.
Herself clearly as a physician and as a woman with wealth to be able to do that. And it's clear that the physicians in the asylum did not take that very well. They did not appreciate that.
Definitely. And so getting at, like you, at the end, I feel like it's in the last chapter maybe of the book, you talk about this point, and Phyllis Weisbart is asking, there's a history of women being forced into asylums. Did you review her psych records, and was she actually mentally ill? And that piece about whether she was or not, right, I think is something that you address. Yeah,
and that's a really high, Phyllis. I actually refuse to answer that question in that I think it's so complicated. One, because definitions of psych disabilities change constantly over time. Do I use today's diagnosis, 1850s, 1900, 1910s, but also because the diagnoses themselves were so gendered and so classed, so racialized, that I don't want to give them that kind of authority. I'm also recognize that I'm a historian. I am not somebody with the skills or license or authority to diagnose anybody. I'm not arguing that psych disabilities don't exist, but that I feel that looking backwards, it's impossible for us to assess those things. And by doing so, I would give legitimacy to the very categories with which, she struggled and are clearly really contested. The medical textbooks from the period, argued that women with her diagnosis would get uglier every year. And so is that what I use to diagnose her? I'm uncomfortable doing that.
Definitely. I really appreciated how you talked about diagnoses being contextual, and I'm sure that's not exactly how you put it, but really the history, the time influenced how diagnoses were given.
And I do think she was a woman who struggled. Can I say that? And she'd been in a marriage for almost 20 years that was very violent. She herself was someone who, one of the ways she made money was by giving out mortgages. And, she did not in very feminine ways give people forgiveness when they failed to pay their mortgage. No, she sued them the next day. This was a woman who, was not traditionally feminine. So I think, she was a woman who knew what she wanted and worked to get it, and but also struggled at the same time.
Right. And some of those actions, and maybe this is being repetitive, sorry, but some of those actions then were used against her in supporting that diagnosis, right?
Absolutely.
So those actions, those behaviors were proof that she was insane.
Yeah, even she tried to vote in 1872, which was the year Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting. And that was later used against her in her diagnosis. There's one point also, spoiler alert, she chased a woman down the streets of Madison with a bullwhip. And it's really hard to figure out why the newspapers aren't very helpful with that. That action was then later used against her too.
Interesting. Well, if I can, this one quote from your introduction, this is right exactly, I think, pertinent to what we're talking about, but it just stuck out to me. So I'm just going to read this little bit. Diagnosis in and of itself is not inherently ableist, nor more specifically is a psychiatric diagnosis inherently ableist. However, ableism is forcefully present when human beings who receive a diagnosis are stigmatized, isolated, and rendered illegitimate, and when their futures are dismissed as void of all good possibility due to their diagnosis. So it's so complex and all kind of encompassing. I don't know, would you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, well, I think diagnoses are really powerful. And I'm interested as a scholar in the social meanings of diagnosis and how socially powerful diagnosis is. And she received a stigmatized diagnosis that really rewrote her past, right? Cast her future as hopeless, pointless. And it's that, I think, that's full of ableism.
What are you working on next?
I've become really interested in Dorothea Dix and the creation of institutions in the US, looking back as to how these things were created and why and whose land they took, and trying to throw it all together.
Yes. Oh, I can't wait for the next thing to come out. Like I said, I really, if people haven't finished it or haven't started it, it's a great read. It's really interesting, and not only that, but it captures such an important and probably more common tale than we care to remember or believe. Thank you so much.
It's been delightful to talk with you, Mari.
You too.
And many thanks to all of you who streamed in for this excellent presentation. I could listen to your conversations many, many more hours than we've heard this afternoon. We are grateful to you, Dr. Nielsen, and Assistant Dean Mari Magler, as well as our interpreter, Amy. Thank you very much. And our backstage crew is Adam Blackburn and Libby Thune for making this possible. So we hope that you will buy the book and read it and think lots and lots about this conversation.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.